Det avslutande programmet ikväll beskriver den process som ledde till att brittiska intressen i Iran förbyttes i amerikanska. Fjärde delen i tema Imperiets Svanesång.
November 1953. En domstol i Teheran. Dr. Mohammed Mossadegh, mannen som gjorde slut på det brittiska herraväldet i Iran, står anklagad för landsförräderi. Han står där därför att Storbritannien och USA har iscensatt en statskupp för att störta hans regering.
Our policy was to get rid of Mossadegh as soon as possible. We didn't think he'd do any good to Iran. In the 2 years that he was there, it was too long for our thinking. He did nothing for Iran.
And don't forget that he opposed the British Empire before any other country in the Middle East had risen against the British Empire, and he was called the man who broke the back of the British Empire and threw the British out of the country.
Vid 1900-talets början var Persien ett land i förfall. Det var inte mycket kvar av de despotiska härskarnas, shahernas forna härlighet. Den verkliga makten låg hos två rivaliserande stormakter. I norr ryssarna och i söder britterna i Indien som såg Persien som en buffertstat. Mutor och korruption var vanliga i Persien. Och Storbritannien utnyttjade sina rikedomar och sitt inflytande till att stärka sin ställning.
The Iranians had somehow got it into their heads, perhaps for historical reasons, that they were not really running their own affairs. That whatever happened in Iran was done by somebody else, and they always thought that it was either done or not done by the British. Erroneously, but one can see how they came to that way of thinking.
Il y avait beaucoup d'anecdotes qu'on faisait sur les Anglais. On disait que s'il y a la pluie, c'est parce que les Anglais l'ont voulu. S'il y a tel type comme Premier ministre, les Anglais qui l'ont nommé. Même dans les différentes villes de l'Iran, s'il passait quelque chose, même s'il y avait un crime, on croyait que c'est les intrigues des Anglais derrière ces crimes.
Under andra världskriget lät Storbritannien, som nu var i allians med Sovjet, sina trupper ockupera Iran för att tillgodose behovet av råvaror. Britterna avsatte shahen, en diktator som hade visat sig Hitlervänlig, och istället satte de hans 21-årige son Mohammed Reza Shah på påfågelstronen. När kriget tog slut och de allierade trupperna drog sig tillbaka krävde iranierna demokratiska reformer och självständigt styre. I främsta ledet stod den gamle demokraten Dr. Mossadegh.
Mossadegh, I don't think that there has been in the last 50 years anybody more prestigious than Mossadegh in the history of the country. Why? For one thing, Mossadegh was incorruptible. The second thing was he was against the power, always stood up to the power. And this started back in 1921 when he went against the coup d'etat government and he almost lost his life. He was imprisoned, he was banished, then he was for some years in his house. And as soon as the Shah left and there was a free election, he was the first member elected from Tehran.
Den iranska bitterheten över den utländska dominansen efter kriget gällde landets största tillgång, oljan. –1909 hade ett brittiskt bolag fått monopol på att utvinna olja i södra Iran. Oljan pumpades till ett raffinaderi i Abadan. Där upphettades det nya svarta guldet, fylldes på fat och skeppades ut i bolagets fartyg. För Storbritannien kom oljan i rätt ögonblick. Första världskriget närmade sig. Winston Churchill, som då var marinminister, övertalade regeringen att skaffa sig aktiemajoritet i den persiska oljan så att flottan, som nyligen övergått till olja, kunde få säkra leveranser. Oljan blev snart nog den drivande kraften inom den industrialiserade världen. Den fyllde inte bara bensintankarna utan också bolagets kassakistor och brittiska statskassan. Den billiga oljan från Iran hjälpte till att få Storbritannien på fötter.
Okay, Jim, fill it right up, boy. It was certainly nice to be able to say that again, and tens of thousands of British motorists took full advantage of the opportunity. Roads out of London, as in the case of other centres, were mostly as crowded as in the good old days before petrol rationing began 10 years ago.
1950 hade Anglo-Iranian Oil blivit Storbritanniens lönsammaste utlandsinvestering. Det var ett av den tidens största oljebolag, och raffinaderiet i Abadan producerade en tredjedel av oljeleveranserna till västvärlden. Bolagets brittiska tjänstemän i det tryckande heta Abadan levde i gammal god kolonialstil.
I'd just been married, so it was the first year of my marriage. And I was married to Eric, who was the general manager. So we had a very beautiful house, and we did an enormous amount of entertaining. In fact, the first year of our married life, I didn't think we ever sat down to a meal on our own except breakfast. And we always had that in our veranda. I think most people had servants. Again, I think there were points allotted to your husband. The size of your bungalow and how many coolers you had and how many servants you had.
Bolagets 70 000 iranska anställda levde inte lika gott. Löner och arbetsförhållanden var usla. Raffinaderiet i Abadan fick allt sämre rykte. Bolaget anklagades för att inte följa sina överenskommelser med arbetarna.
L'immense majorité vivait dans ce que nous appelons en France des bidonvilles. Alors, les conditions d'existence de ces ouvriers étaient absolument incroyables. Et surtout, on savait que l'Angleterre, c'est-à-dire la compagnie, gagnait de l'argent énormément.
You had two groups. You had the Europeans who had everything and the Persians who had nothing. The Persians could not ride the same bus which the Europeans used it at the time or enter any clubs or any housing or any facilities. And this made them more angry than anything else.
There was a wider feeling perhaps that the oil company interfered in internal Iranian political affairs and that it had a wide network of political connections within the country itself.
Iranierna klagade över att britterna tog in 9 gånger mer på oljan än vad Iran fick. Det stora flertalet iranier levde i yttersta fattigdom. I städerna fanns en rörelse som strävade efter en förändring. Det iranska parlamentet blev plattform för en kampanj med syfte att nationalisera oljebolaget. För rörelsens ledare Mossadegh var det vägen till ny självständighet för Iran. En kamp som han hade fört i 30 år. Nu var rätta stunden inne. I april 1951 blev han premiärminister. Men britterna tog honom inte på allvar.
He appeared as a demagogue, not necessarily, it appeared to us at the time, in charge himself, but possibly being used by others. His way of living and general appearance didn't strike one as being the sort of person you'd think of as a prime minister, and I don't mean them because he didn't wear striped trousers. In fact, he always wore pajamas, and that was a rather odd figure for a future prime minister to cut.
At no time before a year or two before 1951 did anyone contemplate that we would ever not stay there forever. We were there by an international agreement between the government of Iran and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. So there was no reason it should ever come to an end as far as we could see.
Tehran. Angry crowds surge through the capital of Iran, currently the world's #1 danger zone. John Bull and Uncle Sam, too, are savagely caricatured. Extreme nationalists demand immediate seizure by their government of the $500 million Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Focal point of Iranian unrest, however, is the government, its cabinet headed by 70-year-old Premier Mohammad Mossadegh, whose single purpose is oil nationalization.
He was a great actor, but he was a marvelous politician, and at that time he had all the people with him. Everywhere you went, they would say, Zindabad, Dr. Mossadegh, Zindabad, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, Nakhast Wazir Mahbub Iran, which means long live Dr. Mossadegh, the beloved Prime Minister of Iran. And they didn't care much what he did. He'd clobbered the imperialists, he'd nationalized the oil company. Iran was a country again. It was great stuff. It was very moving.
We would call him dotty in some respects, but he wasn't impersianized, and some of the very moderate Persian parliamentarians would weep in the Majlis when he spoke, even though they knew perfectly well that it was ruinous for their country and impractical.
Le thème de propagande de Mossadegh, ses partisans, c'était changeons le visage du monde, au moins du monde musulman, en changeant nos rapports avec les Anglais. En mettant fin à la domination anglaise, nous arrivons à changer le visage, non seulement de notre pays, mais de l'ensemble.
The atmosphere was one of complete joy, particularly as if it looked as if there was really no conflict, no opposition within the country, as if the whole country had rallied and found a leader who was going to lead the country towards best times. That was the atmosphere. The press, the newspapers, the radio, the parliament, they all appeared to be united in these events.
När nationaliseringslagen antogs rev demonstranter ner oljebolagets skyltar. Britterna protesterade och de till och med saboterade maskiner när Mossadegh skickade sitt eget folk till Abadan för att ta över raffinaderiet.
The reception was extraordinary because there was a feeling that now all the defects of the old regime, which were, in a word, discrimination against Iranians, all those defects would be removed because all the administration of the industry would be in the hands of Iranians. So they had a wonderful reception on arrival.
There was no question of violent resistance, but extraordinary how pieces of plant would go wrong just when they were supposed to be doing something else, you know. And they soon realized that we weren't being very helpful, really, and we weren't handing over files. We weren't handing over accounts, which they asked us for. I said I had no authority to hand them British companies' accounts unless I was told from London.
Hemma i London ägnade Labours utrikesminister Herbert Morrison sig åt den stora brittiska festivalen som skulle stärka nationens självkänsla. Men Labours planer på en välfärdsstat var beroende av inkomsterna från utlandet. Morrison var fast besluten att stå emot Iran. Nationaliseringen betraktade han som ett slag under bältet. Med kraftigt stöd från pressen hävdade han att Iran handlat olagligt. För att ge mera tyngd åt hans ord skickade regeringen jagaren Mauritius till Abadan.
London, where directors of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company met to discuss the latest news from the Persian oil fields. The man bringing home the news was Mr. Drake, the company's general manager in Abadan. Later, Mr. Drake, at Mr. Attlee's invitation, went to number 10 to place before the cabinet a first-hand account of the present Persian drama.
And I was wheeled into this cabinet meeting, where I understand the entire cabinet, except the minister responsible for oil, I don't know who he was now, and the three chiefs of staff in uniform were all seated round a table. The Prime Minister bid me take a seat on his right, between him and Mr. Morrison, the Foreign Secretary. And I pleaded that we should not allow the biggest foreign asset in Britain to go without doing something about it. I didn't say particularly what was to be done. I had in my own mind that at least we should make a struggle for it. I thought it was a completely unilateral act, and I said that if we don't do anything about this, Within 5 years, we shall lose the Suez Canal on the same principle, which in fact proved to be exactly right, almost to the day.
Labourregeringen skickade fallskärmstrupper till Medelhavet beredda att invadera Abadan. Det blev en larmsignal för USA. President Harry Truman blev skräckslagen över vad han uppfattade som skjutglad ansvarslöshet.
We had perhaps a different concept of the priorities involved. Our main desire was to be sure that Iran was saved for the free world. The illegal Communist Party of some 15,000 members conceivably could have taken over and invited the Soviets in. We thought that this should take precedence, saving Iran, ahead of commercial consideration.
Amerikanerna ansåg att den brittiska inställningen till Mossadeqs regering var kortsynt. Mossadegh var kanske inte idealet, men han kunde bli en nyttig allierad mot ryssarna.
He was expecting the Americans to help Iran by giving Iran necessary, equipment, experts, and allow Iran to export its oil, including to American purchasers. And he thought that America would come to Iran's help because, Americans had expressed sympathy on several occasions with nationalist movements in Iran. And also Henry Grady, who was the American ambassador in Tehran, had helped Mossadegh personally and officially a great deal.
I think the Americans had been largely responsible for the early incitement almost to the Persians to exchange this 100% British ownership. I have to say that. The American ambassador was very thick with Mossadegh.
The American ambassador in Tehran, Mr. Grady, recently paid a call on the Prime Minister to convey a letter from President Truman. It was a message urging Persia to negotiate with the British. Dr. Mossadegh, whose health is apparently not too good, transacts much of his business from his bed, and so it was on this occasion. A strange scene indeed, yet it would be hard to exaggerate the importance of the message or the problem to be solved. Since then, President Truman has sent Mr. Harriman to Persia to use his good offices in the dispute.
I was afraid the British might bring in violence. They had a very strong feeling that they had a contract there. They were very literal in their consideration of the matter. There were contracts being changed, concessions on oil all over the world, and the British didn't give any consideration of that, which they should have.
It was our asset and not theirs. It's very easy to be generous with somebody else's assets. They felt that popular opinion in Iran needed to be satisfied. They were at some distance from the direct economic and financial consequences of what might be demanded. And so it was easier for them to have bright new ideas. It was for us to think of the consequences of them.
They were very arbitrary with the Iranians. They didn't show them the books. They paid them a very low royalty and didn't give them any idea of what they were entitled to. They also imported Indian labor, and the Iranians were unemployed, and that made them annoyed.
Under påtryckning från Trumans speciella utsände gick britterna motvilligt med på att skicka en medlare, ministern Richard Stokes.
Mossadegh used to come occasionally in the evenings and have meals with us. We were out of doors with caviar and servants, and we used to enjoy that. But most days, either Stokes and I would go and call on him. He lived in a very plain little villa, and there he was, always beautifully dressed, standing at the top of these stairs on his cane, receiving us. He was always very charming to me as a younger man, made a point of that. And we never saw him, this reputation he had of appearing in grey pajamas, bed as a sick man and so on. Never once seen that.
Mossadegh said, well, you know what we want. We want to manage our own industry. But we are perfectly willing to keep your employees. We are perfectly willing to have an arrangement with you by which you will have all the oil that you need. But we cannot have you as a concessionaire.
They could never understand the whole problem of selling oil. We tried for, was it a fortnight? Must have been. To try and teach them, educate them, if you like, to the tanker problem. It's no good expropriating oil if you can't sell sell it. You can't eat it. And all the tankers were owned by AOC. All the marketing arrangements, highly complex, were in their hands. All part of an international complex of marketing and price adjustments and so on. And they could never understand it. I mean, Mossadegh, it was like, I mean, it was literally talking a dialogue of the deaf.
Mossadegh believed that either Iran and the Iranians have to develop their oil, or the oil can wait until there are enough Iranians to develop it. He told me once that under no circumstances I am going to sign a treaty or an agreement with any foreigner which in any way compromises the sovereignty of my country.
$60,000 Persians depend on the company for their living. If Abadan closes, there is no work for them. And Abadan must close if Persia holds up shipment of oil. A great organization will close down, and ruin will come to Persia unless obstinacy gives place to reason.
Journalfilmerna speglade Storbritanniens intressen. En förlust av Abadan skulle inte bara innebära förlusten av billig olja och stora vinster, utan också fara för en internationell kartell där de stora oljebolagen styrde marknaden och satte priserna. När förhandlingarna körde fast stängde bolaget raffinaderiet som det ännu hade kontroll över. Den brittiska taktiken var att sätta hårt mot hårt.
I think it was quite natural that the government should mobilize a force. British subjects, many of them, were there in Abadan, and it was useful to have a force there in case they had to be evacuated speedily. There was no doubt the hope also, not shared by everybody, but by some, that a show of force of that kind might bring sanity to what we thought was a situation which lacked it.
Well, our view that this would have been a disaster, and we told the British so in the strongest terms. To send a force in to reestablish an oil concession that you haven't been able to negotiate is just not done in the modern era, and we had reached that time. We told the British not to, because we never thought they would. We always thought Morrison was bluffing. And he was. He made the show that he was going to do it if the technicians were removed, but when they were removed, nothing happened. They left quietly.
Right up to the last moment, Mossadegh did not want the British employees to leave. And he did everything in his power to keep them by assuring to them that they would receive the same treatment, if not better, as far as salaries were concerned, accommodation was concerned, all the conditions of employment. He wanted to keep them quite sincerely, and he kept on saying to the British, let us keep your employees as our employees. They said no.
The last 300 British technicians are evacuated the day before the deadline set by the Iranian government. During the early days of the deadlock, British naval and paratroop forces were alerted in Iranian waters, but today the cruiser Mauritius serves as an evacuation vessel for the men who remained until the last minute during the bitter dispute.
Samtidigt var premiärminister Mossadegh på väg till FN i New York. När britterna inte kunde gripa till våld hade de inkommit med klagomål och hävdat att hans nationalisering var ett hot mot världsfreden. Mossadegh tillbakavisade anklagelsen.
C'est en vain que nous avons cherché ailleurs que dans des paroles, des preuves que l'on.
And his object was to, I think, to cause a split between us and the Americans and play on this Persian patriot, sick man and so on. And I think he rather made rings round us. I don't think we came out best there. Not true, the Americans weren't taken in. They found him slightly ludicrous, but rather fascinating.
He had a great impact on America, because don't forget that the Americans, most of the Americans are anti-imperialism. And they like to talk to a man who has charisma. And Mossadegh had that charisma. He was an actor in politics. He had his own convictions. Yet in politics, he was an actor.
Amerikanerna hoppades fortfarande få Mossadegh med på en kompromiss med deras allierade, britterna. Till och med presidenten använde sitt inflytande. Det blev ingen uppgörelse, men Mossadegh log fortfarande.
Je profite de ces dernières heures de mon séjour aux États-Unis pour exprimer mes sincères remerciements envers la nation américaine qui m'a montré ses meilleurs sentiments ainsi qu'à mes collègues. Il faut changer.
Det entusiastiska mottagande Mossadegh fick i Amerika bara ökade britternas irritation. På hemvägen mellanlandade Mossadegh i Egypten. Där blev han mottagen som en hjälte av ett folk lika fast beslutet att göra sig av med britterna. Men brittiska regeringen ville ingalunda finna sig i Mossadeghs framgång. Den gjorde upp hämndplaner. Aldrig hade Iran och dess rika oljefält känts så ogästvänliga för britterna som i slutet av 1951. Raffinaderiet i Abadan var i iranska händer och Anglo-Iranian Oil Company hade jagats ur landet. Men britterna tänkte inte låta Iran få sälja olja som de ansåg var stulen. De införde totalförbud. Den som köpte olja från Iran fick en rättegång med Storbritannien på köpet.
We were not prepared to see, if we could possibly help it, Iran get away with an arbitrary act of nationalization without compensation and be able to sell oil. We wanted to show the world that they couldn't behave in this way.
Förbudet ingick i en brittisk plan att få Mossadegh och hans regering avsatt. Storbritannien frös Irans tillgångar och skar av handelsförbindelserna. Mossadegh avfärdades som inkompetent.
We didn't think that there was any virtue in rewarding Mossadegh by giving him money. If you had rewarded him in that way, you'd have been perpetuating in power someone who was incapable of bringing any form of stability or prosperity to Persia. For the reasons I've given, he could not govern. And the sooner then that he left power, the better for Persia. Not for us, for Persia.
Bakom ridån av garden parties och formaliteter var det brittiska ambassaden i Teheran som var centrum för operationerna. Secret Service-män från MI6 fanns redan på plats. De skulle uppmuntra oppositionen mot Mossadegh i royalistiska kretsar och på så vis stärka shahens ställning gentemot hans premiärminister. Deras viktigaste iranska agenter var en rik köpmansfamilj, Rashidian, välkända Englandsvänner. Kontakterna sköttes genom ambassadtjänstemannen Sam Fall.
I started seeing the Rashidian brothers in March 1952, and this was a policy of our government and of the embassy in order to have a contingency plan in case the negotiations didn't succeed. We were paying them a small amount of money. I don't know because I wasn't involved myself, but this was for passing a few demands to a likely lad, paying the crowds. You can't do anything in Iran or anywhere else without money.
The Rashidians, I believe, were the British net that was most totally controlled by the MI6. These were true agents in the sense that they worked for the British government and knew they did. What made them very distinctive was that it was important for their type of operation that everyone in Iran would know this. Therefore, when somebody wanted to run for parliament and wanted British help, either straight help or financial help, everyone knew exactly where to go.
Deputies expected to be bribed, I should think, some of them, but they were certainly helped to come to the right decision.
Great silence for the Right Honourable Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister.
Den nya konservativa regeringen ställde upp på Labour-företrädarnas alla politiska program och lite till.
Results cannot be achieved via a wave of the wand. Time is needed for a new administration to grasp and measure the facts which surround us in baffling and menacing array.
De såg sig om efter en kandidat som var beredd att ta Mossadeghs plats och göra upp oljetvisten till fördel för britterna.
Yes.
The question was whether we could overturn the Mossadegh government. I'd had a long association with Iran because of my father's connection with the country. And Iranians who were opposed to Mossadegh kept on getting in touch with me. And one of these was their greatest elder statesman, Gavam Sultaneh.
He was a very wily politician and an operator, and far more likely to manipulate the various parties in the Majlis and get a majority. He was a very, very professional, wily, and I don't say devious, but elastic politician, and he was most likely to get a majority together.
He got in touch with me several times and said he was prepared to do something about it if only the British government would give him their blessing. And he came and talked to me here about it. But the Labour government and even the central government were a bit slow at first.
Tillfället kom i juli 1952. Mossadegh avgick oväntat efter en dispyt med shahen om hans befogenheter som premiärminister. Shahen utnämnde Gavam, uppmuntrad av britterna. Teheran lamslogs av massprotester som krävde Mossadegh tillbaka. Shahen och Gavam satt in armén.
I was taken out by my brother to the area where the main demonstrations were taking place. And you could see the running battle that was going on between the people and the police and the soldiers and even tanks, which I myself saw from a fair distance, and saw in fact one of them shooting, one of the machine guns of the tanks shooting. And the people were extremely determined and extremely angry, and each time they were being driven back into the little alleys, they would surge back and try to fight against soldiers and the policemen with the stones and cobbles that they were picking from the street. Some soldiers and officers went over to the crowd and decided not to shoot, and were carried on the shoulders of the demonstrators. And this was widely publicized and celebrated.
45 personer hade skjutits ihjäl och hundratals hade blivit sårade. Men det rådde tvivel om arméns lojalitet och shahen och Gavam såg sig besegrade. Mossadegh tillträdde igen och lovade en upprensning i Irans korrumperade och brittiskvänliga förvaltning.
The popular reaction to the resignation of Mossadegh in Tehran was such that Gavam couldn't continue. This was a real setback. I think at the same time the military takeover in Egypt was taking place, was it not? It was a bad week.
Misslyckat med Gavam fick Storbritannien att ta till ännu samvetslösare metoder. Under tiden fortsatte de diskussionerna om oljetvisten fast de visste att Mossadegh inte skulle gå med på deras krav.
We've been sitting together with his bedside, iron bedside, for hours and getting very heated about it all. And suddenly he rings a little bell and in comes a servant with a great plate of sweetmeats. And he said, now to send the cameramen in. And I said, look, we're in the middle of a discussion, Prime Minister. Is this the moment really for sweetmeats and photographers? He said, yes. Because sweetmeats will do you good, sugar is very good for you. The cameras, you know, it's an instinctive reaction of all human beings. When the camera comes in, they smile. And he said, we've got 50 cameramen, you'll have to do 50 smiles, then I'll kick him out and we can resume, you'll be in a much better frame of mind. Of course, he's got something there. He really wasn't, he was a highly civilized person.
Leendena var bara diplomati. George Milton gick hem till ambassaden och skrev ett telegram till brittiska utrikesdepartementet. Det fick gå runt inom regeringen. Mossadeghs storhetsvansinne håller på att urarta till ren sinnessjukdom. Det ser nu ut som enda sättet att hindra Persien från att falla i kommunistiska händer är en statskupp. Britterna såg sig om efter bundsförvanter i iranska armén som dittills hade kontrollerats av shahen. Mossadegh var fast besluten att minska monarkens makt. Han tog över posten som försvarsminister från shahen och lät ledande royalistiska officerare gå i pension. Milton föreslog att en av de missnöjda officerarna, general Zaidi, skulle värvas för att leda en statskupp mot Mossadegh. Egendomligt nog hade britterna satt just Zaidi i fängelse för tyskvänlighet under kriget. Och en brittisk ambassadör hade en gång dömt ut honom som fåfäng, ovederhäftig och totalt opålitlig.
Well, I went out to see him when he was living in his country estate, and I used to go out partridge shooting, so if I had a gun with me, it looked all right. It looked like a terrorist act. It looked like a sporting occasion. And changed cars 3 times at his request, and finally drove up to his country estate.
He seemed tough. He wanted to be quite sure that the Shah was with him and the Americans. But he was very ill-disposed towards Mossadegh. He could see Mossadegh was leading the country to hell on a wheelbarrow. And he obviously liked the idea of power and all the perks that went with power.
He wanted an assurance that money would start flowing, really without money to the treasury. And we had talked quite openly at that time of a line of credit or of 10 or 20 million pounds. It sounds like nothing in today's terms, but in those days it would have helped them quite a bit.
Teheran var fullt av rykten. Mossadegh anklagade ambassaden för att vara ett spionnäste. I oktober 1952 bröt han relationerna med Storbritannien och utvisade alla brittiska diplomater. Nu kunde de inte längre genomföra sin kupp. I Amerika hade en ny president just blivit vald, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Kunde hans republikanska administration övertalas att hjälpa till? Brittiska utrikesministern Anthony Eden for och träffade honom. Och han hade med sig folk från MI6 och utrikesdepartementet som skulle överlägga med CIA.
We went there really, I would have said, to persuade the Americans at that stage that we weren't going to get anywhere with Mossadegh and that his remaining in power was very dangerous to both our interests, and also to tell them a little bit about the means we had at our disposal for changing the government. And we felt, after we'd been talking for some time, that they accepted that Mossadegh remaining in power would eventually lead to a communist takeover.
It was my feeling then, it remains my feeling, that the British understood the extent of paranoia in this country concerning communism. This was the day of Joe McCarthy, and that the British consciously played on that fear in order to help persuade us to involve ourselves in the coup.
Eisenhower gav John Foster Dulles i uppdrag att ta hand om utrikespolitiken. För honom var antikommunismen och den amerikanska storfinansen 2 sidor av samma mynt.
One night at the Iranian embassy, the then ambassador Saleh and myself talked to John Foster Dulles. And John Foster Dulles made it very clear that Iran will not be allowed to get away with the nationalization. And his argument was that if we let you get away, then what's going to happen to Kuwait, to Saudi Arabia, to Iraq, and all our American holdings all over the world.
Eftersom reaktionen i USA var uppmuntrande installerade britterna en MI6-grupp på Cypern. Den skulle hålla radiokontakt med bröderna Rashidian i Teheran.
They had a very wide range of contacts, particularly in the bazaar, and the moneyed or hopefully moneyed classes were getting worried. They saw that their prosperity was being threatened, and opinion was building up among those classes against Mossadegh. And they also had contacts with the Ayatollahs and a sort of merchant religious movement going through to the people, and a little bit of rent a crowd sure to have provided a strong popular demonstration against Mossadegh and in favor of the Shah.
Som nyckelpersoner i bröderna Rashidians nät fungerade gangsterledarna i de traditionella idrottsklubbarna, där fysisk träning och organiserad utpressning gick hand i hand. Där fanns män som stod i tjänst hos den härskande klassen i Iran och som kunde skaffa de lejda folksamlingar britterna behövde. Britterna satte framförallt sitt hopp till shahen. Men till deras och den iranska elitens förfäran höll Mossadeghs reformer på att göra honom till en monark med bara ceremoniella funktioner istället för en härskare.
The Shah was exceedingly weak. He was vacillating, and he was afraid, and he just didn't know what to do. He didn't like Mossadegh. He realized that Mossadegh was threatening his position, but he was unable to screw up the courage needed to dispose of Mossadegh.
Shahen gjorde alltså ingenting, men britterna gav inte upp försöket. I mars 1953 krävde en lejd folkmassa uppeggad av Storbritanniens agenter Mossadeghs blod. Intrigerna bredde ut sig, gatans parlament tog över och Mossadeghs anhängare kom till hans försvar. Mossadeghs moderatare anhängare i parlamentet höll på att överge honom, men för första gången fick han stöd från kommunisterna. En vändning som CIA utnyttjade i sin propaganda.
What we did from Washington was to write some of the articles that would appear in the Persian press. And these articles would appear thanks again to the Rashidians, who had contacts, I believe, with probably 4/5 of the Iranian press. And any article that I would write, it gave you something of a sense of power, would appear almost instantly the next day in the Iranian press. And they were designed to show Mossadegh as a communist collaborator and as a fanatic, as a person who didn't understand that you could be both nationalistic and positive.
When weeping, fainting, bedridden old Mossadegh has trouble with the Majlis or parliament, he goes to the people for a referendum to have it dissolved. But more than 100,000 citizens of Tehran, including every available member of the Communist Tudeh Party, turn out to vote yes and be marked with indelible ink so they won't vote again. Understandably, few oppose the skinny old man who controls the army and the police, and the supervisors at the opposition voting place have nothing to supervise. Mossadegh, who is not a communist, has won with communist support. Can he now get rid of his dangerous new friends?
Meistens diese Menschen, die waren Demokraten, Antifaschisten, sagen wir Intellektuellen, auch die Offizielle von Partei, das heißt die Militärelemente, die in Organisation waren, die waren nicht davor, gegen Mossadegh zu putzen, weil sie im Endeffekt selbst Patrioten waren, Nationalisten waren.
A certain number of people thought that he was leading Iran towards communism. That was, you know, the communist bogey which was represented to the United States and was the cause of the United States action in removing Mossadegh. I think that also was totally wrong. Mossadegh was not going towards communism.
Mossadegh had two complexes. One was that he had a martyr complex, that if I die for my country, or if I am jailed, I jail for my country, that's an honor. The second was that he depended so much on the people. He was a kind of the populist person that he said, people always will protect me. And as long as I have the people, nobody can have a coup d'etat against me. And I guess that was the reason that he neglected everything. And even when the coup d'etat came, he didn't do anything about it.
I augusti 1953 var Storbritannien och USA redo att slå till. Amerikanska ambassadören kallades hem för att inte bli inblandad. En amerikansk agent övertalade Shahen att underteckna det här dekretet och så till att det överlämnades till Mossadegh.
The original coup plan was based on the fact that the Shah had the ability to dismiss a government. And therefore, what was going to take place was that an officer in the army would take a firman, a notice, to Mossadegh and inform him that he had been replaced and that General Zahedi would become prime minister.
Le 25, à minuit, on a envoyé des chars et des mitrailleuses avec un officier, lequel était Nassiri, un colonel de la garde royale, signifiant à M. Mossadegh qu'il était démis. Alors Mossadegh a écrit sur l'enveloppe « Reçu, je déciderai ». Il a donné ça. Alors quand on a vu des tanks, on ne vient pas tout de même à 1h du matin avec des tanks pour demander la démission d'un Premier ministre. Et encore, on n'a pas le droit de le demander. Mossadegh aurait dû agir immédiatement et faire fusiller le lendemain, par la loi martiale, tous ceux qui ont été inclus dans cette histoire.
När kuppförsöket blev känt gick Mossadeghs anhängare ut på gatorna och lät sitt ursinne gå ut över symboler för kungamakten. Shahen själv flydde ur landet, Men CIA gav inte upp utan försökte vända protesterna till sin egen fördel.
Dann gab es spontane Demonstrationen. An dem Nachmittag, dem 25. Morat, gab es natürlich eine große Demonstration im zentralen Platz Teheran-Tuprane. Eine große Demonstration, eine der breiteste Demonstration der Tudeh-Partei. Natürlich die den Versuch, das Amerika verurteilt haben, die den Bevölkerung aufgerufen haben, den Mossadegh zu verteidigen und diese nationale Regierung auf der Macht zu behalten. Und die haben für eine Republik sogar sich ausgesprochen. Die haben die Parole des Volksrepublik ausgebrochen.
Well, as soon as this occurred, these two agents that I mentioned saw the opportunity and sent the people we had under our control into the streets and acted as if they were Tudeh. They were provocateurs, but we had more than just provocateurs. We had a lot of shock troops who actually acted as if they were Tudeh people throwing rocks at mosques, at priests.
När det nu rådde kaos i Teheran övertalade CIA de royalistiska arméofficerarna att göra ett nytt försök. Med kopior av shahens dekret i högsta hugg tågade de mot Mossadeghs hus. Samtidigt mobiliserade bröderna Rashidian och deras vänner sina lejda folkhopar att slåss med Mossadeghs anhängare.
That mob that came into North Tehran and was decisive in the overthrow was a mercenary mob, had no ideology, and that mob was paid for by American dollars, and the amount of money that was used it has to have been very large.
There were lots of people in the streets, standing on the pavements and wondering what was happening. There was lots of, in fact, talk and conversation and debate, etc., as well as speculation. And I saw a few lorry loads of people standing in these lorries, looking like ruffians and thugs, carrying clubs and sticks, and shouting slogans against Mossadegh and occasionally in favor of the Shah. That was what was happening in the morning. We didn't take it very seriously. We knew that there was something wrong, but we thought perhaps that things would turn the other way. But in the afternoon, it became clear that things were much more serious, and the news came that Mossadegh's home had been surrounded.
Gradually, the shooting started, and I told him, "Sir, I think it's better you leave the house." He said, "No. If it's going to happen, if it is going to be coup d'etat, I think it's better I stay in this room and I die in this room, and I will never live here."
Striderna kring huset rasade i flera timmar och över 100 personer blev dödade. Teherans pöbel tog hämnd genom att plundra premiärministerns residens. Mossadegh kapitulerade. Kuppen hade lyckats. Storbritannien hade fått sin hämnd och journalfilmerna triumferade.
General Zahedi, the new premier, emerges as the hero of the hour, for he it was who took charge of events and organized the movement that threw Mossadegh from power. The people showed their preference in no uncertain manner, and after 9 hours of bloodshed, the forces of the Shah were in command, and Mossadegh's reign as virtual dictator of Iran had ended.
Shahen hade flytt i skräck från Iran. Nu kom han tillbaka i triumf. Medan Shahen höll offentliga parader gjorde han upp räkningen i det fördolda med gamla motståndare, fängslade dem och avrättade dem. Snart skrev han avtal med oljebolag i väst, men nu var det Amerika, inte Storbritannien, som gav order i Iran. Och Anglo-Iranian, som döpts om till BP, måste dela sitt gamla monopol med amerikanska oljebolag.
Certainly BP didn't come out on top, but they came back with a major share in the international consortium which was subsequently set up. And I suppose from my own point of view, I'd have probably sat there for another 10 years in that appalling heat instead of doing some much more interesting jobs, which I was allotted to later.
In the military court at Tehran, where he's been on trial for treason, the Persian ex-premier, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrates that he knows how to make an entrance. Clad in his accustomed dressing gown and pajamas, he even makes a dramatic scene out of taking his place in the dock. What a performance!
Storbritannien och USA hade lyckats störta Irans enda demokratiskt sinnade ledare, en man med principer som britterna nog på annat håll gärna hade sett vid makten när de själva lämnade scenen.
The West wanted to misunderstand him. None of them is interested in Mossadegh as a person. They're all interested in him as the person who cancelled the oil concession. If they had wanted to understand him, I think a great deal could have been made for the future. As I said, the present situation in the Middle East might not have happened.
1956 nationaliserades Suezkanalen av den egyptiske presidenten Nasser. Britterna svarade med ett invasionsförsök. Ett fiasko som kan skildras, mycket tack vare Anthony Nuttings minnesbilder, i femte delen av Imperiets Svanesång 23.05 nästa lördag. Alla helgons dag i TV2 är i det närmaste till ända. En lördag som föranleder Jakob Dahlin att påbörja en ny klättring på sin stege i ettan. En klättring som leder rakt ut i storstadsnatten. Och dit ska även vi försvinna om vi bara först får servera ett smakprov ur ett av morgondagens program. God kväll.